Hey everyone. Today I'm reading a chapter 4 from Marxism and Democracy by Lucien Laurat. I might read the entirety of this piece eventually, but for right now, I'm interested mostly in what Laurat has to say about, what you might call bureaucratic collectivism. Lucien Laurat was one of the first people on the radical left to describe the USSR as neither socialist nor capitalist nor a workers' state, but some form of new form of non-capitalist class society under the leadership of the bureaucratic oligarchy. So, I believe that most of that content is in this chapter, but I'm not sure. So this will be out of order. Anyway, in terms of I'll probably put this up before I ever even touch any of the other chapters. So anyway, here we go. Chapter 4 of Marxism and Democracy by Lucien Laurat. It's from 1940, or at least the English translation's from 1940. And the chapter 4 is titled The Birth of a New World. Up to the present, we have been trying to retrace the evolution of Marxist ideas. We have seen that the followers of Marx and Engels contributed important clarifications and additions as they were made possible by the development of capitalism and the growth of working-class organizations. These clarifications and additions were naturally worked out in discussion which sometimes became violent, and this caused a number of critics to talk of, quote, the crisis of Marxism, end quote. Every one of these discussions was in fact a crisis, but it was a crisis of growth. A crisis of growth. A living moment which proposes to transform the world and which bases itself upon a doctrine according to which the world itself is in perpetual motion, must ceaselessly struggle to gain new knowledge and to adapt its actions to changing circumstances. This ceaseless ideological struggle, which we may well regard as a succession of crises, seems to us to be the best proof of its vitality. We approve entirely of what Karl Renner wrote in 1933, quote, the task of Marxism in our day is not to explain the writings of Marx by a subtle commentary, or to simplify them by drawing up an inappropriate catechism, but to analyze the new situation of the proletariat by means of the Marxist method. Just as the proletariat has progressed and changed from decade to decade, so capitalism itself takes on new forms suited to every stage of capitalism's development. Therefore, Marxism as a science is in a certain sense timeless. As long as the economic system develops, it will demand an analysis of that economic system's changes by the methods of Marx. Marxism will be dead only when it ceases to renew itself every day, end quote. Karl Renner, 1933. However, in certain cases, these crises of growth may take on more serious forms and even end temporarily in a considerable weakening of the socialist movement and the socialist movement's organizations. When the socialist idea takes root in countries which are only at an early stage of their industrial development and where the working class is still backward, or in more highly developed capitalist countries, it wins over large masses previously lacking in all socialist enlightenment. Then we observe a recrudescence of the whole gamut of pre-Marxist concepts. It was no accident that at the end of the 19th century, Russia witnessed a recrudescence of Sismondism among the Narodniki, of Blankism among the Bolsheviks before 1917, and of Saint-Simonism amongst the Bolsheviks, who developed into bureau technocrats in the period of Bolshevism's degeneration. However, such is the hold of Marxism, of the word, not of the doctrine, on the mind of man, that when reborn, the great part of the primitive socialist ideologies that take a Marxist label, and with the sectarian elan, which characterizes this primitive form of socialism, they claim the title of, quote, the only authentic Marxism, end quote, not knowing that in reality they represent only a relapse into doctrines long since superseded by Marxism. The advocates of this primitive socialism in the newly industrialized countries, like the new recruits to socialism in the more highly developed countries, would like to have their old-fashioned notions accepted as, quote, new knowledge, and to foist them onto working-class organizations which left them behind long before. Footnote. It is surprising to find that in his book Au-delà du Marxisme, Henri de Man considers just the advocates of these pre-Marxist ideas as the, quote, real usufructuaries of the Marxist inheritance, end quote, Henri de Man, and that Henri de Man goes so far as to declare that they have, quote, caused all the latent seeds planted by Marx in the minds of the masses to bear fruit, end quote. It seems to us, on the contrary, that these people do nothing but cloak with a phraseology borrowed from Marx ideas which Marx vigorously rejected. End footnote. After Kautsky, it was Rosa Luxemburg who showed on 2 occasions, in her polemics against Bernstein and Lenin, how these outworn ideas come to life again amongst the masses of the people unenlightened by socialism. Footnote. However, as we have seen, this did not prevent Luxemburg deceiving herself into the belief that the chaotic actions of these new recruits to socialism represented the specific form of the proletarian revolution. End footnote. From this angle, we see that it is not a question of a crisis of Marxism, but a crisis of differing and distorted interpretations of Marxist doctrine. We believe that in the foregoing we have demonstrated that what has failed was not Marxism at all, but the ideas and practices of pseudo-Marxists. Obviously, it might be objected that the failure of Marxism lies precisely in the fact that Marxism did not succeed in winning over these masses of new recruits and saving them from their pre-Marxist illusions. However, as we have already pointed out, the winning over of these masses is a long and arduous task, and it is one which is constantly hindered by the entry of still further proletarian masses into the socialist struggle. Those who proclaim the definite failure of Marxism have let themselves be hypnotized by what has happened in Germany. They forget that everywhere else, where the situation was less tragic, and where socialist parties did not find themselves threatened with avalanches of new elements, suddenly declassed and difficult to assimilate from one day to the next, the appearance of new recruits on the political scene did not at all lead to a weakening of socialism, but rather to the contrary. The fact that the doctrine of Marxism has emerged unscathed from the ordeal of fire to which it has been subjected during the past 25 years entitles us to use the Marxist method without hesitation to examine in this last chapter the economic and social structure as it presents itself to us after the shock of war, the upheavals of the post-war period, the ravages of the last economic crisis. Changes of vast importance have taken place. Where do we stand? Where does the working class stand? What must be the action of socialism and of the trade union movement in the face of this accelerated development? We shall do our best to reply to these questions presently, without, of course, making any claim to distill absolute truths, but with the sole aim of contributing to a clarification of ideas. Section 1. The end of capitalism? Even in circles far removed from the working class movement and its traditional ideology, people are beginning to speak more and more often of the, quote, end of capitalism, or at least of the, quote, crisis of the capitalist system, end quote. Others oppose such talk and declare that, quote, capital is not a special category, but something as old as the human race, something which will only disappear with the human race. Most of the discussions around this question suffer from one initial disadvantage. an inadequate definition of the subject under discussion, and this is common both to the adversaries and defenders of capitalism. The result is that many of these discussions only add to the already existing confusion because each of the disputants has a different interpretations of the terms he uses. The difficulties encountered by those who try to define what capitalism is proceed from various causes, and the most important of these are: A. Capitalism has never existed alone. Throughout history, it has existed only in conjunction with other economic formations, essentially different from itself, and in this way the student has been led to confuse its own proper characteristics with those of coexisting formations. B. There are several types of capitalism. The capitalism of classic antiquity, essentially mercantile and usurious, hardly entered into the sphere of production, and like the similar capitalism of the end of the Middle Ages, and again in the 17th century, had very little in common with the form of capitalism which we call modern, and whose growth and development have changed the face of the world during the past 150 years. C. Capitalism, as a socioeconomic category, transcends all definitions of a technical and psychological order. Those who ask whether this or that thing, machinery, buildings, money, is or is not capital by virtue of its technical properties, lose sight of those social relations, and in particular of those property relations which permit us to distinguish precisely between one economic formation and the other. Those who look for psychological characteristics and insist, for example, on the motive of personal interest, forget that this is as old as humanity, that it existed and still exists in all economic and social formations, and that these formations can be distinguished by the form in which this motive manifests itself. According to circumstances, it comes to its own in an organization at times more collectivist, at times more individualist, and in varying degrees. However, what interests us in this book is obviously modern capitalism. What distinguishes modern from antique and medieval capitalism is that it has gone beyond the sphere of circulation, commerce, and usury, and taken undisputed hold of production. Money destined to produce more money can thenceforth function in production also, not occasionally but permanently, as the general rule. Modern capitalism ended by completely routing natural self-sufficing economy. All the goods essential to mankind became commodities. In all countries in which modern capitalism has triumphed, no one can consume without buying, and to buy he must sell. The market, an accessory factor only for preceding economic formations, has become the vital center of society, the absolute sovereign of its life process. By its inexorable expansion, the new mode of production established what we now call, quote, capitalist property, end quote, parenthesis, modern, in parenthesis, which rests on the fact that the workers, having no property of their own, are compelled to sell their labor power in order to exist. Footnote. In his Capital, Marx analyzed only the English form of this expansion. In Grundgesetz der sozialen Entwicklung, the Vienna sociologist Julius Dickmann provides us with a very interesting complementary study of this problem. End footnote. In preceding social formations, the wage-earning class represented a minor factor, an exception. It is the essential general characteristic of modern capitalism. We have also indicated the difference between modern capitalism and the purely commercial and usurious capitalism of past time. It is also important to distinguish modern capitalism from two other social forms often referred to, slavery and serfdom. Under slavery, the worker is the property of his master just as much as cattle. Footnote. In his De Agricultura, the Roman writer Varro, who lived from 116 to 127 BC, writes, quote, "The instruments of culture are divided into three classes: the speaking class, which comprises the slaves; the inarticulate class, which comprises the beast; and the dumb class, which comprises the vehicles." End quote. Varro. End footnote. Under serfdom, the worker had to serve the seigneur. God, why can I never say this? Seigneur. That's probably how you say it.
Seigneur.
Seigneur. That's what I thought. Okay. Where am I? Under serfdom, the worker had to serve the seigneur in time and kind. In both these cases, it is the law which makes the worker in one case a slave and in the other a tributary. In neither case is he free. In both cases, his maintenance is assured, whether ill or well. A quantitative question does not interest us in the qualitative analysis. Under modern capitalism, the worker is free. No legal pressure compels him to sell his labor power. He can take a job where he likes and when he likes, or remain idle if it pleases him. Only the commodity market, to which he must go to live, compels the worker to subject himself to the changing conditions of the labor market. However, the disappearance of all legal protection corresponds to this legal liberty. If, for causes usually independent of their will, the owners of the means of production cannot employ the available workers, these workers are doomed to starvation. Footnote. Let us note that unemployment insurance is of very recent date. End footnote. On the other hand, the owners of means of production enjoy the same liberty. They too have the right to produce what they like and when they like, to sell their products at any price that seems agreeable to them, to any customer they like, and at any time that seems expedient. However, their sovereign, the market, punishes their errors. The stability of their existence is no more guaranteed than that of the wage workers. We could define modern capitalism as follows. Footnote. Our definition is based exclusively on what Marx wrote in his Capital. Even those who reject it will have to admit that it permits us to form a very fair idea of what Marx called capitalism, though Labriola is of the opinion that Marx did not, in fact, draw the historic contours of capitalism very clearly, and that he always confined himself to, quote, circumlocutions and, quote, generalities. See Arturo Labriola, Al delà du Capitalisme et du Socialisme, published in 1932. End footnote. Shit. Lost my goddamn spot. Can you believe that? Let's see. Here we are. Okay. Capitalism is a system of free economy characterized by the fact that the means of production, too big to be used individually, are thus property of a minority who, for wages, employ the majority, excluded from that property, and appropriate to themselves a part of the value created by that majority, surplus value. But the minority and the majority are legally free. The impersonal authority of the market decides everything above their heads. It is only since the appearance of this system that political economy, the search for the laws which govern economic workings above the heads of the minority and majority at the instance of natural laws, has become a science. Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx formulated the laws which govern this system. The influence of this system is so great that the ideas which have grown up with it, and which are actually specific to it, have been transferred to the pre-capitalist forms which surround it, and which exist within its framework, so that even the artisan and peasant speak of their, quote, capital, whereas a tool of production or a sum of money is not in itself capital, but may become so through its function. A machine is capital not because the machine is a machine, but because the machine is owned by a particular person who uses the machine to let others work, whilst these workers, not owning it, are obliged to accept the conditions which he imposes upon them. The beginnings of capitalism are characterized by a universal process of dissociation and dissolution, accompanied by a contrary process of association and integration equally universal, the dissolution of the final remnants of natural self-sufficing economy, the dissociation of simple mercantile economy and its replacement by the second degree of mercantile economy, capitalist economy, the destruction of all bonds between the producer and the soil, between the producer and property, the atomization of the economic process in the hands of innumerable individuals, employers, absolutely independent of each other. Amidst this atomization, there develops spontaneous association, the automatic coordination of these atoms, the creation of national and world markets, and the drawing in of backward regions and hitherto neglected economic units into the economic system as a whole. Thus there is an atomization into millions of independent economic units, but at the same time the transformation of all these units into integral parts of the mechanism of capitalism. All these economic units are governed by the same law, the law of value, and set in motion by the same motive force, average profit. All are equal before this law, and competition governs the whole. In this chaos, new relations are finally created. In our book, Économie dirigée et socialisation, we analyzed the transition from liberal capitalism to organized capitalism. Let me look this word up. It translates as directed and socialization, which is not quite right. Oh shit, I didn't finish. One second. It translates as, let's see, command economy and socialization. Anyway, in this chaos, new relations are finally created. In our book, Économie dirigée et socialisation, which is, again, command economy and socialization, we analyze the transition from liberal capitalism to organized capitalism. As we are unable to give a detailed study of this development here, we are compelled to refer our readers to this book and to limit ourselves to a summary sketch of the essential traits of these new relations, which have so greatly changed the aspect of traditional capitalism. Footnote. Karl Renner has described and analyzed this new structure with a lucidity which places Renner among the foremost followers of Karl Marx. See his book Die Wirtschaft als Gesamtprozess und die Sozialisierung, published in 1924. End footnote. The process of monopolization, cartels, trusts, and agreements gives rise to organized islands in a sea of anarchical chaos. In addition, it creates multiple relations, of which the following are the four most frequent forms. A. Within industry, in the chain which stretches from the raw material to the finished product, consisting of a multitude of links, enterprises, independent of each other, one link acquires a particular importance. The raw material industry may subjugate the manufacturing industry, dictate its conditions of sale, and reduce it to dependence. The heavy industries reduce the engineering industries in this fashion. The manufacturing industries, on the other hand, may dictate the conditions of purchase to the raw material industries. The sugar refiners reduce in this way the producers of raw sugar. The sugar refiners reduce in this way the producers of raw sugar and the beet farmers. B. Between industry and commerce, one branch of industry may subordinate the commercial branch which sells its products. Coal, the practice of uniformly fixed prices. One branch of commerce may subordinate the industry which has need of it. Importers and exporters of commodities can place industry at their mercy. C. In commerce, wholesale commerce may reduce retail commerce to the position of a dependent. Retail commerce, department stores, chain stores, dictates its conditions to wholesale commerce. D. Between the banks, industry, and commerce, the banks hold industry and whole branches of commerce under their thumb. Industries, and more rarely branches of commerce, found banks of their own or subordinate certain existing banks. All these relations gradually turn an amorphous economic system into a vertebrated economic system. All these relations gradually turn an amorphous economic system into a vertebrated economic system. The process goes into reverse. Atomization is replaced by organization. The integration of scattered units, formerly spontaneous and automatic, becomes voluntary. Freedom at the one pole corresponds with the acceptance of restraint at the other. This process of integration, coordination, and subordination considerably modifies the circulation of value and the distribution of profit. Under liberal capitalism, the total revenue of the capitalist class, surplus value, is composed of P plus I plus R. P represents the profit of the active capitalist, I represents the interest accruing to the loan capitalist, and R represents rent going to the landed proprietors. Surplus value contains a fraction, industrial profit contains a fraction of value which is not surplus value but wages. Sorry, I'm confused here. It says profit, I guess industrial profit or entrepreneurial profit, contains a fraction of value which is not surplus value but wages. A part of the revenues of the active capitalist is, in fact, remuneration for highly qualified work. Parenthesis, quote, wages of superintendents, end quote, in parenthesis. So I guess that would be like CEO salaries. Let us now examine the modification brought about in this distribution by the changes in the structure of the modern economic system. The monopolies, trusts, etc. sell their commodities at enhanced prices at monopoly prices. In this way, they seize a fraction of the surplus value added, which should, according to the rules of automatic capitalism, go into the pockets of other capitalists, and thereby they cause a fall in the rate of profit in those branches of industry not under monopolist control. This fall tends to make profit in these branches of industry approximate to simple wages of superintendents. This fall tends to make profit in these branches of industry approximate to simple wages of superintendents. This is what happens in the economic system as a whole. A transfer of value from a non-monopolist sector to a monopolist sector takes place on a smaller scale, but in a more thorough fashion in the processes which stretch from the production of the raw material to the distribution of the finished product. Originally, under liberal capitalism, such a chain looked as follows. Raw material production, production of machinery, manufacture, wholesale commerce, retail commerce. To each of these links falls a share of the profit in proportion to the amount of capital invested in it. But over and above the profit properly so called, which is a part of the total surplus value, which we have indicated as P, total surplus value, there is, quote, the wages of superintendents, end quote, a part of variable capital paid by the capitalists to themselves, which we have indicated as VS, an abbreviation for variable superintendents. However, when one of these links, for example, the second, subordinates the four others by dictating to the producer of raw materials its own condition of purchase, and to the manufacturing and commercial links its conditions of sale, the table changes. The remuneration of links 2 increases at the expense of links 1, 3, 4, and 5. Should the second link obtain absolute dominance over the others, the chain will finally appear as follows. 1. Raw material production receives wages of superintendents. Production of machinery basically what this chart is saying is that the production of machinery appropriates disproportionate value to that of the raw material producers, manufacturers, wholesale commerce, and retail commerce. So that's what it means when the second link, when the machinery producing sector attains monopoly dominance. Link 2, the production of machinery sector attracts all the profit, properly so called, which belongs to the whole chain, and reduces the other links to simple wages of superintendents. The active capitalists, 1, 3, 4, and 5, have become simple executive agents, mere employees of link 2. Instead of an automatic and proportional distribution of profit, we find the stronger apportioning of the revenue of the weaker. According to circumstances, this new order of precedence may interest the chain as a whole or only one part of it. It happens sometimes that the dominant link subordinates only its immediate neighbors. Thus, we observe that the functions of active capital are slowly being divested of their capitalist character. In a large section of the economic system, the return on capital is tending to become simple wages of superintendents, whilst profit, properly so called, is being seized more and more by the monopolists. The development of the credit system has given rise to changes no less important. Credit is at the basis of the joint stock company system. In the joint stock companies, we can observe a double modification of the distribution of surplus value. On the one hand, the active capitalist conducting his own business is disappearing. Every shareholder is a joint owner of the business. However, the dividends he receives tend to become interest pure and simple. Profit, the most important part of surplus value, is seized by an administrative oligarchy instead of being distributed amongst the shareholders as a whole. These administrators are not the owners of the business, and they seldom take any part in its technical and commercial direction. They control the business as usufructuaries and draw a disproportionate amount of the revenue thanks to their installation at a commanding position in the circulation of surplus value, thanks to a practical monopoly and not to the real function in the economic system or even to sufficient property title. This evolution is similar in more than one respect to that which made the feudal seigneur, at first, the simple leader and protector of his peasants, and later their exploiter. With the disappearance of the active capitalist, his real functions in economic life are being taken over by highly qualified paid workers. This separation between capitalist property and the directive function of the capitalist corresponds to the clear separation between the two parts which the capitalist's return was formerly composed. Wages of superintendents and entrepreneurial profit, industrial profit. Variable superintendence is paid to technical and commercial directors in the form of salaries, and thus appears quite clearly as variable capital, which again, variable capital is capital spent on wages, whilst P, industrial profit, divested of its last semblance of a return for labor, appears openly as the fruit of the exploitation of man by man, and this profit does not go into the hands of the shareholders, who are the real owners of the business, who have to content themselves with the dividend, which is usually reduced to mere interest. I'm assuming that it says to mere I. I'm assuming that means interest, but to a new oligarchy. Karl Marx points out all this in his Capital and in his theories of surplus value. Our whole demonstration is based on his analysis. The only difference between Marx's epoch and ours is that the rudimentary elements of his day have grown and developed in ours. The exception of his day has become the rule of ours. Whilst formerly organized capitalism developed within the framework of free competition, today free competition plays only the limited role assigned to it by organized capitalism. Quantity has now been transformed into quality. The reducing of all those who perform a real function as the directors of economic activity to the level of mere paid superintendents is carried out simultaneously by monopolization and by the development of the credit system, as it is generally joint stock companies which control the monopolies and which represent the strongest links in a given chain. The profits seized by their administrative oligarchy comprise, apart from the profit of the particular joint stock company itself, also the profit of the subordinated links. The monopolist and finance oligarchy thus tend to reduce the revenues of all those active agents in the economic process, both within the joint stock company itself and all those undertakings which it has succeeded in subordinating by commercial relations to the level of mere wages. All active functions in economic life are tending to become subordinate activity, carried out in the interest of a new oligarchy and rewarded solely by wages. The reducing of all active elements to a wage or salary earning class will cause a change in the function of this class itself, when society as a whole takes the place of the administrative oligarchy. This line of reasoning brings us to the conclusion that capitalism as defined by the classic economists and by Karl Marx is now approaching its end. The structure of the present-day economic system is so different from that of liberal capitalism of the 19th century that we find far more points of difference than resemblance. Organized capitalism from the beginning of our century up to the outbreak of the World War marked the transition between the two formations. Today we might say that the differences between the two lie in the things, whilst the resemblances are in terms. Today we might say that the differences between the two lie in the things, whilst the resemblances are in the terms. The old terminology is now being used to describe a state of affairs entirely different from that which gave it birth. The quote, profit of the active capitalist in the non-monopolist sector of the economic system contains less and less surplus value and is being more and more reduced to mere wages of superintendents. The quote, interest drawn by the great mass of the smaller investors, while still remaining a part of surplus value, has quite ceased to be the return of capitalists without function, lone capitalists. It can no longer ensure then a leisured existence, and is changed more or less into insurance. The major portion of the employer's profit does not go into the hands of the active capitalists, but into the hands of a very limited number of monopolists and financiers who usually do not own the property or even an important part of their joint property of those enterprises from which they draw their excessive remuneration. And it is these, quote, functionless elements who take the lion's share when surplus value is distributed. Such changes are unquestionably of a qualitative nature. The capitalism examined by Marx is disappearing. But to those who are inclined to declare that this very fact shows that Marxism has lost its basis and its reason for existence, we must reply that Marx was the first to perceive these changes, and thus to assist us very considerably in recognizing these new forms now that they have come to maturity. We might, of course, engage in long argument concerning the terms suitable for defining this new economic formation, but we must confess that we feel very little desire to do so. Whether this new formation is called, quote, neo-capitalism, or, quote, monopolist and finance capitalism, or even, quote, state capitalism, end quote, we propose merely to point out that all these appellations preserve the term, quote, capitalism, and are therefore, in our opinion, calculated to cause a great deal of confusion. Footnote: in his book, L'Alternative, which has the very significant subtitle, State Capitalism or Democratic Socialism, Emile van der Velde has the great merit of describing very clearly the direction of economic evolution. We see, quote, the alternative, end quote, in the same light as van der Velde does. And it is merely with regard to van der Velde's term, quote, state capitalism, that we must express reserve. End footnote. The world which is being born before our eyes is a new formation, an economic system sui generis, meriting special analysis, and occupying a place of its own in the history of economic formations. The preservation of the term, quote, capitalism seems to us all the more dangerous because it tends to hide something essential to the workers' struggle for emancipation, namely the new conformation of social classes, which must to a great extent determine the tactics, the immediate objectives, and the alliances of socialism. These fundamental structural changes, proclaiming the approaching end of capitalism, have their counterpart in the chronic stagnation from which the capitalist world has suffered since the end of the World War. The laws and tendencies of development formulated by Marx are now more active than ever they were. The various modifying tendencies of development, also formulated by Marx, are showing themselves to be less and less effective. There is unquestionably a close connection between the disappearance of the capitalist structure and the paralysis of the functioning capitalist economy. This connection is characterized by reciprocal action. The change of structure paralyzes the once famous automatism, as Rudolf Hilferding demonstrated in 1910 in his Finance Capital, and the progressive paralysis of the automatic functioning, giving rise in its turn to the development and consolidation of, quote, control levers. In other words, to an increasingly fundamental structural transformation. This development, during the course of which capitalism divests itself more and more of all those characteristics which permit it to be called capitalism at all, liquidates itself, so to speak. It has achieved its highest degree of development in the totalitarian countries whose economic structure shows the clearest characteristics of a period of transition.